I invite our panellists up to the stage with me. Professor Muriel Bamblett, CEO of VACCA. Jill Gallagher, CEO of VACCHO. VACCHO, sorry. And Reverend Alistair McRae from the Uniting Church. I got involved with the Recognise campaign probably about 5 months ago, and the reason that I did that is because as an Indigenous man, I'm passionate about reconciliation, and I think that constitutional recognition goes a long way towards that. In terms of, I hope that it will have that it will change the way that we educate all Australians. Constantly we hear that the way towards reconciliation is through education of Indigenous people and closing the education gap, and I think the door swings both ways in terms of that. We need to educate non-Indigenous Australians on Indigenous issues, and I think if we formally recognise Indigenous people in our constitution, that the way that we educate all of Australians through our schooling will change. The Recognise campaign has just finished its journey in Katherine and at the Gamara Festival, if I'm correct, and they've had. Sorry, am I being corrected?
No, that's
no. All right. They've had over 3,200 people joining them along their journey, and they've gained 11,000 new supporters, which I think is a great effort for a new campaign. Yeah, I think that's worth a round of applause.
As my introduction, my name is Jill Gallagher. I'm the CEO of VACCHO, but I'm also an Aboriginal woman from Victoria, and have lived and worked for many years in my home state, so to speak. And anything to do with the recognition of Aboriginal people in Australia's constitution is dear to my heart. But we all know that referendums don't come around that often, let alone a referendum that seeks to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia's constitution. So when I heard, as CEO of VACCHO and as an Aboriginal woman, when I heard about the journey to recognition and what they're trying to achieve, VACCHO is quite a big organisation. We have not a lot of resources, no government people in the room, but we have resources that we can tap into to assist Recognise and Reconciliation Australia to in their endeavours to raise awareness around what it all means. So when I heard about the journey to recognition, I was adamant that I wanted VACCHO and I wanted me as an Aboriginal woman to be part of that journey. So unfortunately in my role as CEO, I had the opportunity to convince my board and also to convince some other staff from VACCHO to come with me on this journey. And the board, of course, fully supported VACCHO providing resources to help with the campaign, so to speak. But to me, it was more than just a campaign, because I, as an Aboriginal woman here in Victoria, fully support the recognition of Australia's first people in Australia's constitution. So I want to just, if I can, I think I've got 8 minutes, so please keep me on time. I want to tell you just a little bit about that journey and what it meant to me, and I'll introduce the colleagues that actually came with me on that journey. Being on that journey, actually, we drove from Melbourne to Adelaide, where the journey started. The leg of the journey, the driving journey, by the way, I don't think I was fit enough to do the walk from Melbourne to Adelaide. So I didn't attempt that. I didn't want anyone giving me mouth to mouth, so I thought I'd better do the driving leg. So we decided to drive to Adelaide, and then from there meet up with the campaign where it was launched in Adelaide and drive to Alice Springs. But along the road, we actually were fortunate enough to speak to a lot of people. We stopped in places like Coopapedy, and I've never been to Coopapedy before, and it's quite scary actually. But there was a lot of Aboriginal people and not Aboriginal people that we got to speak to. And I was just a little bit overwhelmed about, about, you know, some of the conversations that we were privy to have, and some of the conversations that I wish I didn't have. But there was, from my point of view, an overwhelming, from the people that I actually got to speak to, support for what we were trying to do. There was a lot of non-Aboriginal people and a lot of Aboriginal people that didn't fully understand what it meant or what the Constitution was, basically. So I think there needs to be a bit of work done in that space. But the journey itself left a very lasting impression on me. We got to speak to a lot of remote Aboriginal communities where Aboriginal language was their first language. Unfortunately, here in Victoria, for us as Aboriginal people, English is our first language. And I felt that when I went to some of the remote communities. I felt that presence, that strong presence of their language. I actually was very privileged to ask to speak to one of the Aboriginal communities in Dalkna, and also at I just can't remember. Anyways, 2 communities. But one of the ones at Dalkna, I had to have an interpreter to speak to the Aboriginal people from that remote community. And I found that quite difficult, but I also found it quite exciting to see that there was Aboriginal people interested in what I had to say. And basically what I spoke about a little bit about myself as an Aboriginal woman and about my life growing up. I spoke about a little bit about the 67 referendum. Not that I knew much about it, by the way, because I was born in 1955. So, what was I, 12, 13, something like that, do the maths. But my mother, who is still alive today, she was born in she keeps changing it. She's 88. Okay, she's 88 years old. And so she was born into a country like me where we weren't even seen as citizens. And that story alone just, and I didn't need to understand the language of the people that I was talking to because the body language for me was enough. At the end of my talk, when I spoke a little bit about my history as an Aboriginal woman living in an urban upbringing and how we struggled to maintain our culture, maintain our identity and maintain our languages. And at the end of that talk, people clap because they feel they have to clap. But there was an elder, an Aboriginal older person who came up to me, and she couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak her Aboriginal tongue. But she came up to me and she grabbed my hand and she squeezed it. That language enough was that alone said a lot to me. We need to be recognised in Australia's Constitution. It is Australia's founding document, and I believe that for us as Aboriginal Australians, says a lot if we are recognised. I know I haven't stuck to the speech that I was going to give, but I wanted to actually, before I hand over to our, what do you call it, a mediator or a...
Moderator.
Moderator. That almost sounds like we're going to have a bum fight. But I wanted to acknowledge the young people and a good friend of mine who came along with me on my journey. I took 2 young Aboriginal people with me, Janaea Williams, who's in the audience, I took a good close friend and work colleague of mine who is in the audience, Cherie Waite, who came along with me on that journey, and a young man who's not with us today, a young Aboriginal man from my country, Gunditjmara country, and his name was Cullen Barney. And as a young man, 24, 25, and for Janaya, as a young Aboriginal woman, I believe the journey that we went on has inspired us so much that Janaya, who does work at VACCHO and is my EA, basically wants to devote all VACCHO resources to the recognition of Aboriginal people in Australia's Constitution. Yeah, sounds good to me too, Muriel. So if we are successful with a referendum, and I think we can be, because it has been done in the past, I think it's an evolution of Australia as a whole country, one country. It's the evolution of our country, I believe, in the right direction. So thank you.
What an absolute honour to come here tonight and speak with you. Can I begin firstly by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and paying my respects to elders past and present. My people are Yorta Yorta Jajarung, and I'm a very proud Aboriginal woman, and I'm so fortunate to have been grown up by very strong elders, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and to have had that background in my life. Can I acknowledge as well the panel and my esteemed colleagues, and Keith Gove for your role in co-chairing. I think it's important that we have Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal driving the agenda, particularly around constitutional recognition. Absolutely great to have a young person, Michael. You're doing us proud up here. I'm very proud of you. I'm going to give a lot of really sort of information about why the Constitution. I really wanted to sort of say why it's important, but I also want to say what's wrong about it as well, because it's important to know why it's wrong in its current format. Last year, you would know, late last year was the 20th anniversary of the Redfern speech, and what a great speech, that was back then at that time by the previous Prime Minister. The constitutional recognition that we are seeking is linked, I believe, to that historic speech that was made by Paul Keating. Many people remember that? How many times have you heard that? I love listening, that word, you sort of had that droning voice, and you can remember it. But he said then, and I quote, "The starting point might be to recognise that the problem starts with non-Aboriginal Australians. It begins, I think, with an act of recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the diseases and the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion." At that time, it was a truly brave speech. Most people at Redfern on that day believed that they were going to get this monologue of commitments. They were so inspired by him. When he first started off, you could hear the crowd. They were loud, very jittery. As he started to say those things, the crowd became very quiet. How great was that? Some would say that the Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's apology as well was a landmark time. I was fortunate enough to be in Parliament House on the day he did that. It was an emotional time. There were tears everywhere. I, myself, was just so proud of our Prime Minister. I was proud to walk around the streets of Canberra that day, to feel for the first time really safe, to say I was Aboriginal, to see the Aboriginal flag, to see Aboriginal people driving around in their cars with the Aboriginal flag. But I was more proud when I came back and heard about all the children and young people that insisted on watching the TV and watching the apology. Australia was overwhelmed by that and actually showed that day that they were truly proud of their Aboriginal people. I guess we as a nation, we struggle to return to that high point of official recognition of the truth by the non-Indigenous community. Some would say that, as I said, that the PM, he did a bit that day. But today I want to talk about how we can right the wrongs of the past and set the record straight for the first and finally, because I think we need to acknowledge that we are the first peoples of this country, and the first peoples should be recognised in our federal constitution. I guess one of the profound ironies of our constitution has been how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been included in the past. Before 1967, the First Peoples were mentioned, but in a negative way. Laws couldn't be made for us by the federal government, and we couldn't be counted on the census. As per most of our history since invasion, we were spoken of only in the negative. How much do we know about our Australian Constitution? The Australian Constitution is a set of rules by which Australia is governed. Anybody looked at it? How exciting is it? It's really a tool to guide government, and how it governs the country. It sets out how the parliament works, what powers it has, and the roles of government and ministers. The Constitution came into effect in 1901 after the states agreed to form the nation of Australia. Anybody know who's not included in the Constitution? What state? Who knows? Sorry? Western Australia. Western Australia was federated later on, so our Constitution doesn't even include Western Australia. Ironic, isn't it? When the Constitution was originally written, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were mentioned, but they were mentioned in a negative way. For example, Section 127 made it unlawful to include Aboriginal natives when counting the number of people in the Commonwealth. Unlawful, so you couldn't count us as people. Section 51 stated that the federal parliament can make special laws for people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. This changed obviously with the 1967 referendum, which amended the original constitution to allow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be counted when determining the size of the population. However, the current constitution does not expressly mention Aboriginal people at all. So we fought to get that racist bit of, legislation changed, but now we're not in it at all. For us, we have to have a referendum, and the only way to change the constitution is if a majority of voters in a majority of states vote yes at the referendum. Now, a referendum is a vote by Australians on a specific change to the Constitution. How many people know how many referendums we've had? And you're not allowed to tell me because you probably know. How many referendums have we had? 40? 44. Close. I haven't got anything to give you, but thank you. So 44. How many have been successful? 8. 8 out of 44. Isn't that amazing? So have we got our work cut out for us? Certainly we have. In 1967, after 10 years of campaigning, a referendum was held to change the Australian Constitution. That referendum saw more than 90% of voters vote yes to have Aboriginal people in the census and give the Commonwealth Government power to make specific laws for Indigenous people. Although Aboriginal people were still not recognised in the Constitution as the First People, so whilst it recognised us, it didn't recognise us as First Peoples. In 2010, the Gallagher government announced the appointment of 20-member expert panel on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. That expert panel held public meetings across Australia seeking Indigenous people's ideas or concerns for constitutional change. In 2012, the panel reported back to Parliament with a number of recommendations. What I can tell you is that they held 400 public meetings across Australia and took over 3,000 submissions. What I can tell you also is that they had to consider how they would get constitutional recognition over the line, making it too complicated, making it too hard. We know of votes that have gone before a referendum before that were a dead certainty, but they were aligned with 2 questions. So one question was fairly simple. The second one didn't get the referendum over. So when we're looking at change, we need to make sure that we are very clear about what we're putting up. Some of the recommendations from the panel were to remove Section 25, which says that states can ban people from voting based on race. So that means the Commonwealth can ban people on race. To remove Section 51, which can be used to pass laws that discriminate based on race. So that needs to be removed from the Constitution. What they recommended also was to insert a new section, 51A, and that's the one we really want to make sure gets up. And that's to recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and to preserve the Australian government's ability to pass laws for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it's really important that we get recognised. Panel also recommended that they be inserted a new section, which was 116A, which banned racial discrimination by government, and insert a new section, 127A, which recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages were this country's first tongue. And so many experts are saying, do we go to have people recognised, or should we? And constitutional lawyers are working on this at the moment. Should it be around culture and native title and based on more things that are more tangible rather than recognising people? Because you might get access through native title, then you've got access to language you know about and culture. Some of those things are things that constitutional lawyers say might get across the line easier. They also, and so confirming that English is Australia's, at the moment, it's confirming that English is Australia's national language, but it also makes recognition that there is a First Peoples and a First Language, and that there is a language for First Peoples. So where to from here? Obviously, we know that the government will consider the panel's recommendations. The government has invested funding to help build public awareness and community support for constitutional change. It is proposed to conduct a referendum in 2015, but there are some parts of government that have made a commitment to, if they get in and get elected, it could be very quick. Will that have really serious implications? Because done too quickly, if we haven't done our work to engage, it could actually be work against constitutional recognition. We need to come up with a model, and what everybody's looking at is that constitutional reform within the next 2 years. What will the model be? And I think that a lot of the work, and you congratulate UME, Unity and Antar and RecVic for their work on trying to begin the process of engagement. But one of the issues is we haven't really worked out how to engage Aboriginal people. What does it mean? We know that there will be no way that the government doesn't have responsibilities for making policies in relation. So this is not about its commitment to addressing, but I think it can be able to get better access to better health, better services by having in the Constitution recognition of rights. And so I think that from my point of view, the reason that I really wanted to engage in this was because it's right. It's right. I work for the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency, so I see child welfare, I see children that have been removed, placed outside of their community with no connection, don't know their family, growing up not knowing that they're Aboriginal. And to me, that's the biggest shame that we can have, is that we grow a nation that doesn't see being Aboriginal as being something to be proud of, and that this country should own its First Peoples, own its languages, own its native, all of what we are, and so be proud to own us as a people and acknowledge. I come from a country where the Aboriginal people are the First Peoples, to say that. I know that when I go overseas, there's more respect for Aboriginal people overseas. If I say I'm Aboriginal from Australia, people go, this is wonderful, I've never met an Aboriginal. Isn't it great to meet an Aboriginal? I feel really honoured. It would be lovely to have that said for young people to feel it. A lot of our young people don't feel safe in the school ground. If they say they're Aboriginal, they have to face up to the racist taunts. Do you know what it's like for an Aboriginal child if there's been a negative story on the TV the night before to go to school? They get taunted with, and if you're Aboriginal, you've got to know like standing up in front here, you've got to know all about Mabo, all about WIC if you're an Aboriginal. You know, do you know all about the Constitution? No. But as Aboriginal people, I think we get a lot of pressure and our children get a lot of pressure. So I need to move on because I've probably taken more than my 8 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Morgan. Is audibility better from here or over there? This okay? Yeah. Good evening, everybody, and also I'd like to say it's a real honour to be up the front here with Jill and Muriel and Morgan, and thank you, Keith. My name's Alistair McRae, and as was indicated, I'm the immediate past president of the Uniting Church in Australia. I had somebody come up to me recently and say, didn't you used to be somebody? I sort of hope I am still somebody, but there's a connection between that and what the movement to recognition is all about. It's about identity and place in this community. And I think that's what's at the heart of this whole drive. We all know that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders in this country are, by any measure of well-being, severely disadvantaged in this country. And you can trace that right back to the myth of their non-existence from the earliest days and from subsequent denial of basic human recognition and rights. So this is an attempt to address a significant gap in our national consciousness as reflected in the law book of the Australian people. I was invited to be part of this panel tonight because the Uniting Church has itself been on a journey of constitutional amendment. We have, part of our church is called the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress, and that was formed in the late 80s. And in 1994, there was a very fulsome apology offered by the church to Aboriginal people, not only within the life of the Uniting Church, but in this nation, for the damage, witting or unwitting damage, caused to Indigenous culture and spirituality by Christian mission. And the outworking of that apology led the Aboriginal part of our church to say, look, we receive your apology. They withheld forgiveness because they said we just need to sit with this for a while and work it through. And they were probably saying, we've heard lots of cheap words from the mainstream Australia, including the church. We want to see where it's going to go. So there was a movement stemming in our Congress to have the law of their church amended to reflect the fact that our church has its being and its mission on Aboriginal land. So we agreed to a preamble after many years of consultation and discussion to a new preamble to the church's constitution. And it's a historic, it talks about the history of the relationship, but it's also a theological document. It says in different words to this, but it says God didn't arrive in this country in the bags of the missionaries. You know, God was here already. Well, but that's actually quite a profound theological statement. And that God self-reveals through Aboriginal law, custom and ceremony. Now that might seem like nothing to you, but it's theological dynamite. And we had consultations and discussions all around the country. It was debated at length at the National Assembly. It was passed there, and then to become law in the church, very similar to the constitutional process, it has to be referred to all of the state councils and then to all of the regional councils. And myself and the chair of the Congress went on a tour of the country, and of the 6 state councils, 6 overwhelmingly agreed to the change in the Constitution. And then we had to have more than half of the regional councils, of which there are 43 around the country, and 41 of those regional councils endorsed the change. I won't tell you which state, the 2. You don't want to know. You don't know.
No, I do. No.
Do you? Can you guess? I'll tell you later. It was way up north.
Western Australia.
North Queensland. North Queensland. So, but basically the turning point in that debate in the church was at the national meeting, was when one of the senior lawmen from East Arnhem Land got up and said, law, the oral law is very important to our people, the written law is very important to you. We want our place written into the law book of the church. So that preamble has been adopted. It's been there for 2 years, and the challenge now, of course, is to, on the basis of those words, to actually put some actions towards greater reconciliation in the church and in the community. So it's been a fantastic experience for the church. I think, well, we definitely are the first church to do it in this country. I suspect in Canada, a couple of the churches are ahead of us. But we're hoping to. There is interest amongst some of the other churches in Australia to go on their own journey, but I think there are a few steps back. But we are very supportive of the recommendations of the panel for the elimination of the race-based parts of the Constitution, for recognition of the Aboriginal and Islander people as the first peoples of Australia, removal of the possibility of discriminatory legislation. We support the federal government's capacity to legislate for the benefit of Aboriginal and Islander people and for the recognition of Aboriginal languages. So what we've seen from the expert panel, we are broadly in support, and we hope that the Australian community will take this rare opportunity. It would be devastating. It would be really devastating if it didn't receive the support, and hopefully if it is accepted, it will just mark a new point of maturity for our life as a nation and provide a much sounder basis for true justice and reconciliation.
The first question's to Jill. Do you think constitutional recognition is a priority for Victorian Aboriginal communities?
That's a hard question to answer, I think, Morgan. As a Victorian Aboriginal woman myself, I believe it should be a priority. But I'm also aware that as Aboriginal people who, when you look at all the data out there around the health status, the housing issues, the education, attainment issues, even though they're improving a little bit, the unemployment rates, the incarceration rates of our people in the justice system, they're also priorities for us on the ground. So how do we juggle it all? That's a challenge for us. But I do believe it is a priority, and it should be a priority. I think there needs to be a lot more conversations in Victoria, conversations with Victorian Aboriginal communities, but also a lot more conversations too with non-Aboriginal Victorians. I'm not sure what's happened to date. I think this is the second sort of function that's sort of officially been sort of organised here in Victoria. I mean, and if the plan is to go to a referendum in 2 years' time, it took 10 years to get the 67 referendum up and successful. So I think we've got to be mindful of those matters, and I think the conversations still need to happen. I had a chat when I came back from my road trip. I had a chat with Recognise in Canberra about these matters, and they assured me that the current journey that's just completed is only the beginning. And I'm assuming these sessions that we're currently at tonight is only the beginning. But there needs to be specific conversations with the Victorian Aboriginal community. And I think that needs to happen in every jurisdiction. So I believe there is a lot of support and it should be a priority, but I think we've got a lot of work to do.
Okay.
On a very practical level, I think it would right the wrongs. I think it would be about constitutional recognition is really that it would set the record straight. I think it would indicate, and I mean, if you look at the Constitution, as I said, it really is about setting up the government, how it will operate. But it's our founding document, but it denies the fact that there were Indigenous people in this country, that we were actually here. It denies the fact that we actually did fight for the lands. We did, and all the massacre sites demonstrate that. The level of the number of Aboriginal people whose scalps hang in Canberra, the number of Aboriginal people that, you know, you see chained up that fought and died. And so I think that to dismiss what Aboriginal people for 60,000 years lived in this country and what we added and all of what we bring to this country, you can't on one hand acknowledge that we exist in our art, in our music, and you can't roll us out to dance when there's an Olympic Games, and then on the other hand have your documents not recognise First People. So I think we've got a bit of a false. We're sort of, and if you ask everybody in the street, they know. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the first peoples of this country, but our documents don't say it. I think for me, and I've written myself some notes, I want to say, constitutional recognition will open the door for rewriting our founding documents. Today's children will grow up knowing the truth. I went to school, I never learned anything about Aboriginal. It wasn't in the history books. And I've had to deal with the most terrible amount of racism. We're all dirty, black and lazy and expect the welfare as our rights. And isn't that a terrible way to think about, and how do we get to that position? Who put us in that position? We were people with status. We had the land, we had the environment, we had our economies, we had a political structure. We were a very sophisticated people, and all those things were taken away from us. So I think it's about recognising. They're now starting to recognise that what we did with the land was actually best practice. A lot of our work in child welfare, they recognise as best practice. A lot of the way we run our Aboriginal health services are now put up as best practice. So Australia's starting to turn around a bit to say, well, what we're doing with Aboriginal is actually best practice. So I think it's about constitutional recognition is about righting the wrongs.
The Church has recently changed its preamble to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. What impact do you think that has had within the Church?
I think because it went through such an exhaustive process to get passed, it was a lot of hard work, but it means that the result has a higher level of ownership across the Church. That's my concern about the process in the wider community. It's really, there's a massive education exercise that needs to take place, and what RecVic's doing is part of that. But what we learned in the Church process was that a lot of people are just ignorant. We're still very ignorant about the general history. And once people hear a true account, then most people change their minds and prepared to consider a new way of looking at things. I've just finished reading Bill Gamage's book, The Biggest Estate on Earth. If you haven't read it, that's like, well, for me it was sort of like a new conversion experience, just seeing the whole country in a whole new way, because it describes very sophisticated land management that was happening here well prior to 1788. Amazing book. But in terms of the church, it's had a huge impact on our Indigenous members because, again, it's this recognition thing. They say we're now in the law book. And as I said, if you read our preamble, it's only a page long. But half of it is really like an act of confession, to use the Christian language. It's really acknowledging our complicity as a church in the devaluation of language, culture and spirituality. So for people who've been on the wrong end of dominant culture, to hear at least a recognition of the harm that's been done and a preparedness to work side by side for justice is part of the process of healing. The bigger piece of work is to get it more deeply into the consciousness of the whole membership of the church. And again, that's an education process. I ran a couple of sessions in my local church 2 months ago. We had 40 people there each night. And when they went through the history and read through the preamble, they were just absolutely lit up and excited by the whole thing. And I think most Australians, when they're given the information, are generally very good-hearted and wanting to do whatever they can do to mitigate the damage and to build a much healthier community.
I believe that for a referendum, if it's going to have any chance of succeeding, and I'm no expert here, by the way, believe me, but, I think simple is good. It needs to be simple. What's been proposed needs to be clear and it needs to be simple. If it's complicated and people don't understand it, people won't vote for it. I think it's very important that the education and awareness, we have enough time to create that groundswell. And that was the result, one of the successful recipes for the 67 referendum. I think timing is also very important. I think it's really important that, like if we rush it and not given it enough time for people to comprehend, understand and support, we've also got to think about, is there other referendums going to be proposed? Like for at the moment, what the referendum in the media at the moment is to recognise local government. Would be silly to go up and put another referendum because it might get lost in the... So timing, are elections looming, all that sort of, I think that's really important. But I'm a bit of an optimistic. I believe if we do it well, if we time it well, if we allow enough time, I believe the majority of Australians would support it. They did in the 67 referendum, that was successful. And I think we've come a long way since 67. Well, I hope we have anyways. So I believe the majority of Australians would support a referendum, but we've got to allow that time, Morgan, and we've got to be very strategic, and I support Kerry's sentiments.
There are some people that make a lot of money out of Aboriginal people staying disadvantaged and not recognising Aboriginal people. So I think we've got to be prepared for, there'll be scaremongering. There are people that are really non-informed, and so they will fight and oppose this. And I think it's around, because I don't want your land, I don't want your house, I'm not interested in sending you back on a boat to wherever you come from, if that's, and I don't mean that to be disrespectful to anybody in the room, but there's just a view, there's some really fear-mongering, terrible views out there about what Aboriginal people want and why it's so important. We obviously can't start all over again, but I think that we've got to be prepared that there will be people that will come out big, hard and strong at this, and it could be people that are in the mining industry who have things, who may fear that they will lose things because constitutional recognition could change the way native title works. It could change the way we treat the earth and the country. So I think we have to be prepared. We can't be naive enough to think that everybody's going to support this 100%.
Section 51A that basically, and I don't remember the whole wording, word for word, but where it talks about it, the Commonwealth Government having the rights to make laws for the best interest of Aboriginal people. Something like that. I think we've got to be very careful there. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I think we need to have, and I'm no lawyer, so I can't interpret it from a legal point of view, but who decides in the best interest? So, so there's some of the things that Aboriginal people are already having conversations about. So we need to have that conversations, and we need the Aboriginal people who are a lot more knowledgeable than I, who can be in the room and explain what it means. And we need the Aboriginal lawyers in the room to explain to us what it actually means. That's what I'm saying.
Our church does support, well, we haven't seen the final wording, but we support the general directions. I don't really agree with Chris that it doesn't have meaning. We're being told by all the Aboriginal organisations I'm aware of that these proposed changes will be meaningful. 80% of surveyed Australians generally support constitutional amendment, so presumably they think it's meaningful. A lot of people are a bit cynical about words, and they say words are cheap, and words can be cheap, but words are also extremely important. They can be creative and they can be destructive. So good, truthful words are very important and can be meaningful. So to use an old philosophical phrase, I'd say that constitutional amendment is a necessary but not sufficient process. It's absolutely necessary that we at least achieve a level of recognition in the Constitution, but it's not enough. It'll be a new beginning. We've had a number of critical points. I think Kevin Rudd's apology was definitely the high watermark of his political leadership. That was a turning point. This will be another one, and then the whole community will need to look, well, what's the next thing to aim for? How do these words actually start bearing the fruits of justice?
I think that the constitutional recognition will have more effect than just the actual recognition of Indigenous people. George Williams said that he saw constitutional reform as a starting point for realising Aboriginal justice. Muriel, is constitutional change enough?
I think that what we all want is a just and equitable society for all, and particularly for Aboriginal people. And I think that if you're looking at current systems, if you look at, and he talks about a starting point for realising Aboriginal justice. Well, Aboriginal justice is about recognising that Aboriginal people don't have justice in this country. We're the most disadvantaged. If we weren't disadvantaged, would we be even on the face of this country? If it wasn't for the level of need in the Aboriginal community, would people even know we exist? If it wasn't for the disadvantage, and it's unfortunate that so many of our people are disadvantaged. And if you look at the situation for Aboriginal people in this country, we're overrepresented in criminal justice, overrepresented in welfare, overrepresented in child protection, overrepresented in family violence. But if we weren't there, where would we be? Where would we be? I mean, 80% of our families are doing really, really well. They're kicking goals. They're really achieving out there. But at what price? Are they families that deny their Aboriginality so that they can achieve? Are they families that have to struggle every day to get up every morning and deal with an unjust, inequitable, a system that talks down to them, treats them as less? So I think that, I think Larissa writes, I love what she says, and she talks about rights. If you give me human rights, does that take anything away from you? If I have rights, does that make anything? So if you give me the right to be recognised as First People, is that going to make you any less? Does it take away your rights to be who you are? I think that's a really important thing, that giving rights and recognising Aboriginal people, is it going to take anything away from you as an individual? Is it going to take anything away from this country? I think that's a really important point to hang on to. Rights for Indigenous people doesn't mean that anybody is a loser. My understanding, it's moved through both houses of Parliament and that both partisan, but it's still, as well, we have to get a majority of the states as well. So majority of the states and territories we have. So whilst you've got the Commonwealth driving it, you've still got to get the states and territories to actually come on board. So if the majority of the states and territories don't agree to it, if we do have some really... And a lot of it has to be with whether who holds the balance of power. There's so much in politics these days. So if, say, for instance, the majority of parties are Labor that are in state government and then we get a Liberal government, quite often people will vote against what the major party, or they'll go differently. So there's lots of things that we've got to be really aware of. But yes, bipartisan support is there. There's the Prime Minister and the Deputy Opposition have both committed to the constitutional recognition. I guess there's concerns about how quickly they're calling for it and whether we're prepared.
I'll just add to that as well. Currently, or before the recognised journey started, only 30% of Australians were even aware of what constitutional recognition was. I believe that would have changed since the recognised campaign started. I don't have the specific statistics on that, but for the referendum to pass, you need a double majority, and that means that not only do the majority of Australians need to vote yes, but the majority of each state need to vote yes as well. So it does give hope that that the referendum will pass, but there's still a lot more awareness that needs to be raised before a referendum should go to Australia.
First of all, a comment. One of the messages we've got from our Congress members is that this is a white fella issue and they're pretty tired from struggling for justice for so long, and they're wanting some support, and they're wanting change within the whole community. So, in one sense, it is. I think there's a significant responsibility on the dominant culture to put their hands to the wheel. What's in it for mainstream culture? Well, this is sort of a church answer, but I'm saying it just as an Australian citizen. There's something very powerful about truth. And so much of our nation's history is built on a lie. And to actually name truth accurately and make that the foundation for building a fair and just society is absolutely fundamental. So reconciliation requires truth-telling. The preamble in the United Church Constitution is basically an attempt to tell the truth about what's happened in order that some sort of healing and reconciliation can take place. So I think truth and justice is good for everybody. Someone once said, if you want to measure the health of a community, you don't assess it by the strength of the GDP or anything like that. You ask how is a community, how are the least well off faring? And as we've heard tonight, on most measures, Indigenous people are doing it tough. So that indicates to me that we are not a healthy society. So the naming of truth, it's good for everybody, and I resonate with what you were saying, Matt. My personal journey, I also grew up in Gunai. I was going to say Gippsland. But my earliest memories of school, we lived near Lake Tyers, and we had a lot of the kids from Lake Tyers at the school, and I feel deep shame now when I remember how marginalised those children were and how overtly racist the rest of us were. Didn't even name it in that way until relatively recently. So, yep, I'd just say truth is good. It's good for everybody.
Not to my knowledge in relation to a voice for Aboriginal Australia at that level, no.
I think that the panel had that put to them. I mean, there were various things put to the panel around treaty, around sovereignty, and so the panel really, thought to get constitutional recognition, what did they put in? And people did say that, recognition as First Peoples, there was quite a lot of things, and so some of the things that, there's rights and outside of what can be in a constitution, and so I think the panel was looking at how do we get it over the line? How do we get recognition? What's the one, some of the things that are likely to get the constitutional recognition over the line. So I think when we were talking about how the status, they thought that if you get it recognition, then you start to can build on that.
And work on representation after
Yeah.
that.
Peter, it's my understanding that, and as I said before, I think there still needs to be a lot of conversation around those issues you've just raised, but other issues around a particular dot point that they're recommending. But it's my understanding when I asked this question of recognise, and the response, I asked that same question, does it negate our rights as in relation to treaties or anything else that we may wish to pursue? And the answer that I got, and I sort of think that maybe that might be the right answer, I don't know. But the answer that I got was, we need to start somewhere. The beginning is the recognition of us as Aboriginal people in Australia's constitution. So I don't know whether that answers one of your questions, but that's what the recognised mob, when I had that conversation with them about, because I knew there were concerns out there within our own communities around that particular matter, and I'm not sure whether it does, but I strongly believe as an Aboriginal woman it is the beginning of those conversations, the recognition of us in the Australia's constitution, that is. I can say, and I'll let Muriel respond too if she wants to, I mean, we have those same concerns. I mean, when you look at all the current data around the education attainments, the health status, the gap, the life expectancy gap, family violence, our own children in, the amount of our own children in out-of-home care. There are those pressing issues that we are dealing with, probably not at a rate we'd like to, by the way. And from my own personal point of view, as an Aboriginal woman, and how old am I? I'm 58. I'd like to die knowing that this country recognised my people and my family. I really would. So to me, it is a priority.
But if this passes, how is it going to improve the quality of life immediately? Oh, there's no way that it can. I mean, but clearly to wake up in the morning and know and see positive imagery, to know that the country recognises you, acknowledges you and places an emphasis on the special place that you hold in this country. At the moment, as I said, if it wasn't for the overrepresentation, if we did tomorrow address family violence, if we did address drug and alcohol, mental health and all of those issues, which stem really from, the harshness of the treatment of Aboriginal people, if we weren't, rounded up and put onto missions and reserves, if we weren't treated, we're treated less than across the whole of, have a look at all the surveys. They say of the least preferred people, you always see Aboriginal as above somebody. I remember growing up when it was, the Greeks and the Italians. We were second to the Greeks and the Italians. Then the Chinese, we were second to them. Now it's Muslim. I don't want to be disrespectful, but why are we down the bottom? Why are we the least preferred people in our own country? Why do people see us as dirty? Why do they see Aboriginal as not adding? Why in a country where we are the first peoples are we second-class citizens? And the Constitution recognises us as first-class citizens. We have a right to be recognised as first-class peoples. We also have a government that is responsible for family violence. We have governments that are responsible for bringing about outcomes. Where they fail is they don't work on self-determination principles. They don't empower Aboriginal people to be able to take control of their own affairs and to come up with solutions. It's micromanaged. It's around, this is the model that'll work for you and this is what we'll fund you to do. And we'll fund you to do this, but we'll have most of the work that's delivered in the Northern Territory is delivered by non-Aboriginal people. So why are outcomes so poor? Because Aboriginal people don't live. We've got used to a do-for approach. You do everything for us, and we've got to change. If people feel that they have control, they will make better decisions. And I think, unless we have constitutional recognition, then we're going to have people that are forever going to be disempowered by a system, because the Constitution sets a framework for recognition.
I just want to add to what Muriel's saying. When Kevin Rudd said sorry, I was also in Parliament House, but my sister, who works at St Vincent's Hospital and has done for many years, she told me a story, and that story was about in the emergency room of St Vincent's Hospital, they have a TV, and on that TV they were watching the apology. And there was a regular customer, an Aboriginal man, an elder, who was sitting in the waiting room of emergency to be seen. Michelle was in emergency that day, and they were all transfixed on the TV and they were watching it. Michelle looked around, and I won't mention the elder, she looked around to see, to give him a hug, whatever. He had tears streaming down his eyes because the power that apology had on, might not have had the same effect on everyone, but the majority, I would say, it had a profound effect. And I believe the recognition of us in Australia's Constitution will be profound, because to me it's saying, and Australians, all Australians, should celebrate that here in this country you have the oldest living cultures in the world. That's something we should all be proud of. Because I know I am, and I know I'm a part of it. So thank you.
I was listening to a constitutional lawyer and I think there was a show on APAC, and she was talking about the race relations and about, you know, the issue of poverty and family violence and the overrepresentation, but not to get the two confused, that Australia has obligations to all peoples, and they should really, the Constitution is really about powers of the government, and it really is, as I said before, they reckon it's the most boring. I haven't read it all. Has anybody ever read it? No. It's nuts. Oh, somebody put their hand up. You really? You were amazing. Was it riveting? CLAP? Was it? Oh, but I mean, I think it's a nuts and bolts. It's how they will elect people. It's really, and it's not how it will actually provide services to community and what the policy. It's not a policy. It's not written from a framework of services and those obligations. So it's really about how you will, you know, it's to govern, and it came out of England. So, you know, when they were talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, because you may be able to answer this, but, you know, like when they were looking at the preamble, if you look at the current preamble, it's really lots of, there's nothing in the preamble to introduce Australia to, or, you know, because it's framed in England. So it really is just in the preamble, it's an introduction to about the Queen and the bits and pieces, how that document will be used in Australia. So it's not even, the preamble's not even exciting reading. So it doesn't tell you that, you know, the history of Australia, or even that, it's not even there that Captain Cook came. So it's that's how sort of dried.
I mean, the whole notion of an Aboriginal race is it's a nonsense anyway, but, you know, it's a whole plethora of
nations.
Many nations. So they favour the removal of that and focusing on all Australians and using disadvantage as a general measure. I think that makes sense. The other thing in terms of the benefits, I mean, we still talk about Australia as the land of the fair go, and that's taken a hammering again in recent years in terms of other social policies. But I still think that language has some. I think it still has some credibility, and I think the notion of what's fair is still something that's not just a good feeling, but what's wrong with good feelings. If we can say this is a fair thing to do, I think that could be quite persuasive.
But I also don't think we're in it for the benefits. I don't think it's about what we can get out of it. It's about state and history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Factual history. And so it's not about what I, as an Aboriginal woman, if it was successful, what I'm going to get out of it. Whether it's more services, which I doubt, whether it's more resources going into Aboriginal communities, which I doubt. It's about stating the facts and the history of this country. That's what it's about.
I mean, we've got so many, you know, the fact that we're so diverse, I mean, we're individuals. There are people that will go with the heart. There are people that are going to hear it. You know, there'll be people that'll see it. There'll be people that, you know, different ways of engaging. But, you know, I too, like, I was never a reconciliationist. I sort of thought, well, wait a minute, we're reconciled. It's the rest of Australia that needs to be reconciled, the fact that, you know, we've been here. But I did participate in the Victorian walk, and at the end of the walk, I stopped at the start line, and I just wanted to see the people walking, and I wanted to know a little bit of why are you walking and who are these people. And the one thing that really, really struck me and really got to my heart and made me really think, I saw a man, a quadriplegic. He got off the train, he came out the railway station in a full wheelchair, and he had made his way into the walk that day and did the walk, you know. And I think he sent a message to me that it's important for Australia, and it's important for a lot of... And how do we do that? How do we engage for the reconciliation? So I do think that it is non-Aboriginal people that will get it over the line, but how do we message it? How do we actually, you know, get in touch with the emotions, but how do we also get into the intelligence? And I think that maybe your stats are wrong about how many people are actually got parents that are born overseas. I think it's a lot higher. It's a very high percentage of Australians. So what's the imagery around that? Because I certainly remember in Australia's history hearing about how when the Italians and the Greeks came here, there was a white Australia policy and that they were spat on as they got off the, you know, the boats. And so Australia's got a very selective history about how it portrays. And so I think that we've got to work out how do we actually talk to Australia and get the message out to Australia. But it isn't going to be Aboriginal people like us, because people think we've got a barrow to push. I'm going to get something out of this, and so the more non-Aboriginal people. But how good is it? I mean, you can say a few words, and some of you give us a little bit more oomph to go out and think, oh, that was nice to hear that.
That's what I was after.
Yes.
I think that you preach to the converted, you get this feeling of, yes,
Exactly.
I feel good about it.
Yeah.
What about the people who don't know anything about Aboriginals, or the people who are downright racist? How do we approach
But an Aboriginal person, if you walked up and said, I support reconciliation, if, you know, like it's like the Aboriginal flag at the moment. You put an Aboriginal flag anywhere and I feel safe. I feel safe to go there. It's around, if you had, you know, non-Aboriginal people walking around and saying, I support Aboriginal people as the First Peoples. Imagine like that. I mean, people would really gloat at that. I mean, kids use the Aboriginal flag as therapy. We use it as cultural safety. We use in every aspect of our lives the Aboriginal flag because it creates safety. You know, doctors, hospitals, ambulances, councils, everybody's putting Aboriginal flags up. And Aboriginal people know that that place is a place where they can feel culturally safe. I think we've got to create an imagery that's more than just a facility. It's about people.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this evening. I'd like to thank you for coming out and showing your support, and to follow on from what this gentleman touched on, it's about having the conversation with people that aren't aware of constitutional recognition and the impact that it will have for Indigenous people across the country. And as hard as that is, it's an important part of what we, as those that are privileged enough to know about it and to be informed, need to do to have this referendum passed.